You step right over them without a second thought, and you wince the moment you see one. If a doctor put maggots on your wound, you would run. But in a hospital right now, that is exactly what is happening, on purpose, with a prescription, and results antibiotics cannot match. Here on Wild Planet TV, the familiar stops being what it seems, so subscribe. The real question is not what maggots are for, it is why we assumed the answer was nothing. Because this creature does a job almost nothing else can. Here is the assumption that almost every single one of us quietly carries. Maggots are a sign that something, somewhere, has gone very wrong. Spoiled food, a forgotten bin, an infected and neglected wound. They feel like clear evidence of neglect and never a solution. And that instinct of ours is not actually irrational at all. It is built directly from one very real biological fact. Maggots truly are drawn to dead and to decaying tissue. But what almost no one ever learns is what they do next, and just how astonishingly, unnervingly precisely they actually do it. First, a maggot is simply the larval stage of an ordinary fly. It is the soft-bodied, legless phase that hatches out of an egg, before it transforms into a pupa and then into a full adult. Biologists call this whole strange process complete metamorphosis. The animal does not simply grow bigger between each of its stages. It essentially rebuilds itself entirely, its whole body plan and all. It is one of the most successful survival strategies on the planet, and the flies are among that strategy's very greatest beneficiaries. The order Diptera includes every single true fly on Earth. It is one of the most diverse insect groups on the entire planet, with well over 150,000 described species, and by most estimates, far, far more still remain unnamed. The maggot stage exists for one single, tightly focused purpose: to eat as much as it possibly can, as fast as it possibly can. All of it to fuel the enormous transformation that lies ahead. And that focus, aimed at dead tissue, is exactly what makes it useful. Now look closer at the strange little body doing all of that eating. A maggot has no legs, no visible head, and no real eyes at all. Traits that look like clear limitations until you understand them. That tapered, segmented body moves in a very special, clever way. It contracts and releases its muscle in smooth, endless rolling waves, a kind of crawling that scientists call peristaltic locomotion. It pushes forward through soft or even semi-liquid material, where actual walking legs would only ever get in the way. Its mouth is reduced to just a pair of small hooked structures, used to anchor itself firmly in place and to tear at the tissue, while its surprisingly powerful digestive enzymes go to work. And here is the single strangest design choice of them all. The maggot spends its whole life with its head buried in its food.
So it does not breathe through the front of its body at all. It breathes through a pair of openings at its rear end instead, a neat solution for an animal that lives face first in its own meal. Every single part of it is optimized for one relentless task: to find dead matter and then to consume it completely. To understand why maggots are built this way, you must look back far. Flies, in some form, are genuinely, astonishingly ancient creatures. They have been part of Earth's ecosystems since the age of the dinosaurs. Fossils place the early true flies well over 100 million years old, and some studies push the fly order back even further still, all the way into the distant alien Triassic period. For that entire vast span, fly larvae have done the exact same job, finding dead organic material and quietly breaking it down, before it can ever pile up and accumulate all around us. Long before there were doctors or medicine as we understand it, maggots were already the planet's original, tireless cleanup crew. Every single forest floor has quietly depended on this cycle, every riverbank and every carcass ever left out in the open, for far longer than most animal groups have even existed at all. That deep-time role also shaped the incredible senses of its parent. A female blowfly can detect the chemical signature of decay from a genuinely striking and considerable distance away. Researchers found she can locate a fresh body remarkably fast,
sometimes within just a few minutes of the moment of death, guided by scent receptors tuned almost entirely to decay. She then lays her eggs directly onto that exposed tissue, and within about a single day, and sometimes even far less, depending very closely on the temperature all around them, the eggs hatch into hungry larvae that begin feeding at once. There is no pause and no moment of hesitation whatsoever. The cleanup begins the very instant that they first arrive. Now let us break down what that larva is actually doing, because this is where the whole story gets genuinely interesting. First, maggots do not chew in the way that we picture chewing. They secrete digestive enzymes onto all the tissue around them, breaking it down externally, entirely outside their own bodies, before then ingesting it back in a soft, semi-liquid form. That is the first reveal, and it is a genuinely strange one. Maggots digest their food outside their own bodies before eating it. Second, those very same secretions have another hidden effect, one that scientists did not fully appreciate until quite recently. They appear to have real, genuine antimicrobial properties, helping to actively suppress the growth of certain bacteria in the very tissue that the maggots are actively feeding upon. This single detail is the reason medicine ever looked at them twice. Third, maggots are selective in a truly, deeply remarkable way. It seems almost impossible for a small creature with no eyes,
and a brain far, far smaller than a single grain of rice. The species used in medicine is called the green bottlefly. Its larvae eat only the dead and the dying tissue, while leaving the healthy, living tissue almost entirely untouched. It can clean a wound right down to the healthy, living tissue, and then, quite remarkably, it simply deliberately stops. Fourth, as they feed, they also physically stir the wound itself, and that appears to help disrupt the tough bacterial biofilms, the shields that some bacteria use to hide away from antibiotics, biofilms that make certain infections almost impossible to treat. With medication alone, those infections can be entirely untreatable. Comment the word cleanup if this is changing how you see them. And this medical use is not some strange fringe experiment. It has a real and a fully official medical name. It is called, quite simply, maggot debridement therapy. And in several countries, including the entire United States, it has formal, official, and complete medical clearance for treating certain difficult wounds that simply will not heal, particularly in patients suffering from diabetes-related ulcers or wounds that have stubbornly resisted every other treatment. The maggots used are specially bred and completely sterilized, bred very specifically and only for this one single purpose. They are placed on the wound underneath a fine mesh dressing, left there for a single, carefully controlled period of time.
And then, when all of the work is done, they are removed. It sounds almost impossibly and unbelievably medieval, and in a certain real sense, it genuinely truly is. But not at all for the reason that you would first expect. Because the very strangest part is not the therapy itself. It is how modern medicine actually managed to rediscover it. Something that battlefield surgeons had already carefully noticed, generations and even whole centuries earlier than this. Go all the way back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars, to a military surgeon named Dominique Jean Leray. He documented something that made absolutely no sense at the time. Wounded soldiers whose injuries became infested with fly larvae, and those wounds healed far more cleanly than all the others, cleaner than similar wounds kept completely free of them. That single strange observation resurfaced again and again, most notably among the military doctors of a much later age, during the major brutal conflicts of the early 20th century. They found something that simply should not have made any sense. Soldiers whose field wounds became infested with hungry maggots, left completely untreated for days before reaching any hospital, sometimes had cleaner, healthier wounds than all the others, cleaner than the soldiers who had received prompt medical care. The very insects that should have made everything so much worse were, in specific documented cases, actually making it better.
It took many long decades of careful and patient study, and much later still, the rise of drug-resistant infections, for that strange battlefield observation to finally become a tool, a deliberate clinical tool, rather than a mere coincidence. The old handwritten clinical reports are genuinely hard to read. Share this with someone who thinks maggots are only disgusting. Fly larvae have also quietly shaped modern science itself. The fruit fly, Drosophila, has changed all of biology forever. It has been a vital research organism for well over a century, and much of that crucial research happens at the larval stage.
Fruit fly maggots helped unlock the very principles of genetics, of development, and of the deep process of aging itself. Principles that reach far, far beyond just insects. Because so much of how genes control growth turned out to be shared right across the whole animal kingdom, humans included. An animal that most people would never once look at twice has quietly helped to build the entire foundation of genetics, all from a creature you would find hovering over your fruit bowl. Step back from the hospital and the story grows larger still. Maggots are one of nature's most important primary decomposers, part of the small group that breaks down all of the dead matter and returns its locked nutrients back to the soil and ecosystem. Without decomposers like fly larvae, all that dead material accumulates.
Nutrients would stay locked away inside carcasses and fallen matter, instead of cycling back into the living, growing plants. And the balance of most land ecosystems would slowly begin to shift, in ways that scientists consider to be genuinely destabilizing. Scavengers, soil microbes, and plants all quietly depend on this. They rely on the decomposers finishing all the work quickly and doing it reliably and completely every single time. It is not an exaggeration at all to say something remarkable. Maggots are part of the invisible infrastructure of life itself, the hidden machinery that keeps all our land ecosystems working, quietly, constantly, and entirely far out of our sight. That same enormous appetite has started to look like a resource. Farmers now use the larvae of a creature called the black soldier fly. They consume genuinely enormous volumes of our food waste and farming byproducts that would otherwise simply be thrown away. Then they are harvested themselves as a valuable protein source, as feed for both livestock and for aquaculture, a quickly growing part of genuinely sustainable agriculture, using an animal that most people would happily pay to be rid of. Forensic scientists rely heavily on maggots too. Flies colonize a body in a strict and predictable sequence, and larvae develop through recognizable stages tied to temperature, so investigators can accurately estimate the time since death. A real hard tool used in genuine criminal investigations. And some cultures even choose to eat them, entirely on purpose. In parts of Sardinia, a cheese is left open for the flies. Their larvae then ferment it into a prized local delicacy. So go back one final time to that quiet hospital room. The maggots on that wound are not an emergency at all, and they are not in any way a failure of care either. They are a job shaped by over 100 million years of practice at telling the living tissue apart from the dead. The animal you step over is helping some patients keep healing. Maybe we simply decided they were disgusting far too soon, before we ever asked what they were doing. Subscribe. Next time, the earwig.